Imperial Russia was known for its fabulous Fabergé Easter eggs. And an exhibition at the recently reopened Museum of Russian Icons takes a bedazzled dive into that tradition and opulence. Nicholas Nicholson, co-curator of Tradition and Opulence, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me this morning.
So we'll start by asking you how the egg came to have such significance, bejeweled experiences in Imperial Russia.
Well, the egg, of course, is a symbol of rebirth and of birth itself in almost all cultures. So it's not surprising that this is one of the great symbols of the Easter feast, which the Russians call the Feast of Feasts. Eggs decorated in very simple manners have been exchanged for a very, very long time. By the 18th and 19th century, as you noted, we see much more luxurious examples.
And how did it come to be? It seemed to be very much embraced by the Tsar and Tsarina.
The exchange of eggs is a tradition that actually comes to Russia from ancient Byzantium. There was a ceremony at Easter in which the Byzantine emperors would exchange kisses and gilded eggs with members of the high Byzantine aristocracy. This is something which is actually done all over the Orthodox world even today. The exchange of eggs and kisses is an important part of the Easter holiday.
And at what point did it become customary to have them become bejeweled and basically enhance what the eggs looked like?
Well, initially eggs were exchanged, they were painted red. Then in the 17th century in Moscow, we have records of people exchanging eggs that were gilded. But it's really in the 18th century when Catherine the Great starts ordering elaborate porcelain eggs to be exchanged that the tradition begins, when eggs begin to be made of precious materials. In the 18th century, porcelain was more expensive than gold. And by the 19th century, eggs were being made out of silver, silver gilt, enamel, and diamonds and precious stones.
Did they come to have personal intent? Were there personal nuances that were designed in them?
Well, in the 19th century, when the exchange of porcelain eggs became a standard gift from the members of the imperial family to courtiers and friends, they took on a very specific form. They began to be distributed with monograms.
Fabergé, I think it's a name that endures still. People know it. How did Fabergé sort of rise above the others?
Well, it's important to note that Fabergé was not the first person to produce gilded or enameled eggs, and he was certainly not the only person to do so. He was, however, the only person who was approached by the imperial family to make one specific egg every year for the emperor to give to his wife.
Well, with Fabergé, going back to Fabergé for a moment, was there something distinct in the design or the artisanship that one could tell immediately, aside from it being gifted by a member of the imperial family, that this was Fabergé?
Well, Fabergé was a very important international luxury firm, and so people looked to the firm for their exceptional artistic design. The designs from the House of Fabergé drew on sources from all over the world in all time periods, and we see particularly in this period the influence of 18th century France. So there are a great number of objects that are done in the French style, which were particularly popular in St. Petersburg, where the aristocracy often looked to Paris and sometimes lived in Paris as well as in St. Petersburg.
How do you describe what we see on view at the Museum of Russian Icons, the collection that you've pulled together? Of course, not all just eggs.
The exhibition was conceived actually to present an overall view of the tradition of Russian egg giving during the holiday season of Easter. Easter is the great feast and the most important one of the Orthodox calendar. And so it was important for us as curators of the exhibition to look at liturgical objects used during Easter, the early types and manners of eggs which were produced by all kinds of makers, and then to focus on the different genre of eggs produced. There are porcelain eggs, silver gilt eggs, eggs made of enamel, eggs made of hard stone, objects made in egg forms like photograph frames and desk clocks, all of which served to remind people of the importance of the Easter feast all year round.
I understand that a lot of them had a lot of uses, including perfume, as you mentioned, clocks.
Absolutely. One of the two interesting forms that were specialties of the House of Fabergé are bonbonnière eggs, which are eggs which open up to hold hard candies. And we also have vinaigrette eggs, which are miniature eggs that open up to conceal a small perfume-soaked pad, so that in the middle of a rough evening or a terrible smell, a young woman could or an old woman could unscrew the Easter egg on her necklace and get a blast of perfume.
Very industrious, multi-purpose. What was happening historically in Russia at the time of many of the artifacts that we see in this show?
Well, in the 19th century was a time of immense change in Russia. Russia moved very, very quickly from an agrarian society to an industrial one. And as a result, vast industrial fortunes were made and a middle class was established. And both the aristocracy and the high bourgeoisie were looking for this kind of beautiful luxury object made by hand.
What is the significance of red with the eggs?
Well, red is for all Russians the color of Easter. And the great Orthodox tradition is that after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene went to see the Roman Emperor Tiberius and gave him an egg as a symbol of Christ's resurrection, telling him the story. The Emperor Tiberius said that's about as likely as having had happened as if this egg would suddenly turn red, and it did. So that's the tradition that the Russians have, and that's why they dye eggs red at Easter.
We know, of course, there was such upheaval in Russia after the Tsar. How do you have so many of these pieces, so many of these eggs in the exhibition?
Well, I think the important thing to notice is that since all of these eggs were personal gifts, they were really very highly valued by the people who received them. In many cases, in particular, there's a wonderful miniature egg necklace that belonged to Princess Galitzin, who later became Madame Rodzianko. These were treasured objects that were brought with them after the revolution. There were, of course, also major sales in the 1920s and 30s of Russian luxury objects that had been confiscated by the Bolsheviks and sold abroad in the West. So those were bought everywhere from Lord & Taylor to stores like À la Vie Russie in New York and Wardsky in London.
And finally, as you're working with this collection and this array of pieces, what did you find most enchanting as you spent this time with them?
This is actually, we have objects from an enormous number of collections, and each of these collections focuses on different types of objects. We were very fortunate to secure a large loan from the McFerrin Collection in Houston, which is the largest private collection of Fabergé in the United States. We even had objects come as far away as from the Georgian Republic. The Rodzianko collection gave us an enormous amount of paper and ephemera, postcards that were used during the First World War, and one of my favorite pieces in the exhibition, which was actually a visual guide for illiterate people on how to calculate the date of Easter using their fingers, which is just a fascinating and extraordinary survival.
Well, Nicholas Nicholson, it's such a treasure to have this exhibition. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having us. And I hope everyone will socially distantly come to the Museum of Russian Icons in Clinton, Massachusetts to see the show.